Bam.
Hi, this is Stephen Budd, and you're watching the Break It Down show.
This is so cool. I get to talk to the most amazing people. I sent a website with musicians, attached to it, and you said, "Hey, is this for me or for the musician?" And I looked, and I'm like, "Yes." and, and now we're talking. But you've had this incredible career, really in the arts in general. But I thought you might just give a real quick bio for those people who haven't happened to encounter you yet.
Okay, sure. Do you want me to start from the beginning?
Yeah, whatever you want to do, wherever you feel like you want to
All
start.
right.
It's up
Well,
to you today.
I'm a music manager based in London in the UK. I've been working in music my entire career from when I was 15 years old. I'm now a lot older than that. I'm in my 60s. And I started off as a roadie when I was 15 years old. And my very first gig that I got paid for was Motorhead's first ever gig. And so I was kind of a bit of a baptism of fire. So I was on the road for a number of years until I was about sort of 19, and when I started a small record label here in London, putting out 7-inch singles around the end of the punk era. Um, and then thanks to people like Jeff Travis, who ran Rough Trade Records, who would buy all of the vinyl that I would put out, that allowed me to record albums with a couple of the artists that I was working with, which I then licensed to major labels. But of course, they needed a manager. They needed somebody who was actually going to do the do of booking the gigs. So I ended up managing artists. So that was the beginning of the career back in 1979, 1980. And then moving forward throughout the 80s, I ended up managing various artists. Over the years, I've managed bands like Gang of Four, Magic Numbers, Heaven 17, artists that you may have heard of, right up to the current date, managing artists like Songhoi Blues, Dry the River, currently managing an artist called Nubian Twist, which is part of the whole British London jazz scene. But in the mid 80s, I got into managing record producers and songwriters. And my first client was David Bowie's producer, Tony Visconti, who had his studio in Soho, which I ended up running as well, which was called Good Earth Studios. And I learned, really at the feet of the master, a lot about record production, although I never became a record producer. Well, I've produced a few records, but not properly. I ended up creating the business of managing record producers, and was one of the very lucky, timing wise, to be one of the first people involved in doing that side of things. And my second client was Arthur Baker, who of course was the guy who was at the birth of hip hop, who had produced Planet Rock by Africa Bambaataa. And I went over to New York in 1985 and found him. And at I can't remember which club it was now, but I think it was the Paradise Garage in New York, and he was DJing there, and I persuaded him eventually to get on a plane and come to London and do mixes, and there's lots of stories involved, all of that. But I ended up managing record producers and built a career managing and selling record producers to record labels and organizing the business aspects of the making record side. And that I continued to do throughout the 90s and 2000s. And I had a lot of successes working with everybody from Madonna through to U2, from Lana Del Rey through to Dido, and here, there, and everywhere. And that took me to a lot of interesting places. And of course, that whole business changed when Napster came along and all the rest of it. And I got involved in the live music side of things. So I had sold my management company and merged it with a business that had started some small live music venues in the UK, and that grew and grew. And eventually we owned a whole bunch of live music venues in the UK and started some festivals. And then I was involved in starting a festival in India called the NH7 Weekender, which to this day is now the biggest independent rock festival, or rock festival generally, multi-music genre festival in India. And then I got involved in running a project called Africa Express with Damon Albarn from Gorillaz and Blur, which is a musical collaborations project between African artists and Western artists, when we took people like the Red Hot Chili Peppers or Franz Ferdinand or Paul McCartney, John Paul Jones of Led Zeppelin, the Libertines, the Yeah Yeah Yeahs, God, a whole variety of people, to different countries in Africa, such as Mali, Congo, South Africa, Nigeria, and got them to collaborate and work with local artists over there. And we'd film all of that, make records, put on shows, put on cultural events, do that kind of thing. So, you know, that was a labor of love project. And there's a few other things. I did a few big charity projects where putting on artists like Ed Sheeran and Coldplay and a whole variety of others playing tiny little gigs in people's living rooms with Sofar sounds, and or in the Barfly Club, which is the place that we had in London. And then we would do that as a lottery ticket gig. So people would buy a lottery ticket, which will allow you to be one of the people in the room. But we sell hundreds of thousands of lottery tickets specifically for WarChild, which is a big charity over here that looks after kids in war zones, and for Amnesty International. I did that for them for their Give a Home refugee program. So that's a sort of summary of I was the chairman of the Music Managers Forum, which is the trade association for music managers. I did that for a number of years. I've been on the board since it was formed in 1992, which is now an organization that's in 20 different countries around the globe. And I now consult on techie type things for you know, like music related NFT projects and things like that. But I'm still very much involved in the management side, still managing producers, still managing songwriters, still making records, still, you know, going out to different places around the world to put on festivals. And I neglected to mention one in Korea called the DMZ Peace Train Festival, which is a festival up on the border there. That's it.
Just that. So when I was reading about your background, and again, as you were talking about it and everything, it's like I picture like the John Peel session covers where they have like all these bands, you know, Jimi Hendrix, Susie the Band, and you've just done so much, but in the modern form of music, right? And so you've adapted, the market has moved around you. You're like, oh, I'm here. You've had a knack, it seems like, for being ahead of, or at worst with the market most of your career. Is that just because you're in there, or do you see things and be like, there's an opportunity? Because like when Napster come, my friends and I the other day were talking about, um, is anyone making great music like Rush? Will there ever be another band like Rush that lasts a long time and makes relevant music for its fans for decades and decades? And it's hard to know because of how the market is driven by something other than the band, right? So it's really hard to build. We were trying to think of like the last really massive band that came out, and all of the recent ones are from a long time. That's not to say that they're not making great music these days, but the market has evolved. Have you had a knack for sorting what was next?
Sure. I mean, you know, look, things are breaking through, but they're breaking through in non-traditional ways. You know, you look at BTS, they're probably one of you know, they can stand up against, in terms of numbers, whether you like them or not, in terms of numbers, they can stand up against, you know, some of the biggest artists in the world. You know,
Right.
Adele breaking through in the last 5 years, 6 years, maybe more, is another example. Obviously, Coldplay going a little bit further back. But, you know, it's, you know, a lot of the market, you know, moved towards, certainly the American market moved towards hip hop, and that became the dominant form. I think that we're going to see now coming out of Africa and the Afrobeats artists, people like Wizkid, Davido, these kind of people are Burna Boy, becoming enormous, and they will become more enormous because it's off the back of using the diaspora as a launch platform, but really, you know, we have to get our mindsets out of just this sort of Anglo-American European lead that we've had for the last 40 years, because we were the dominant culture, right? The dominant entertainment culture, right? And start to think of, you know, now that across Africa, you know, the entertainment sector has become so important, and, you know, and internet penetration has grown. So people are playing on a level playing field. The fact that the Koreans can do what they can do, and they're now doing it multiple times with Blackpink coming out straight after.
Yeah.
Yes, you know, this is not a fluke, you know,
Right. Right.
this is not a one-off. So we'll see artists coming out of India. We will see artists coming out of China, you know. But, you know, if you look on YouTube, the biggest figures are for Indian artists. And that's not surprising if you think about it, you know, because of the population, you know, it's quite staggering. And some of these artists are going to cross over here, you know. So, but for me, I've always been music first, money second. You know, it's
Right.
always been, it's a failing of mine, to be honest, because it's always been for me, you know, get involved in the music that you really love, that you like. Hopefully, if you do good work, some money will come out the back end of it, and you never know how much it's going to be. I would have probably made a lot more money if I just focused on, right, I'm just going to focus on working with artists who I know are going to be really commercially successful, you know. So but for me, it was always about the music first. I was a fan. I continue to be a fan. Right now, the thing that keeps my juices flowing the most is what's going on in the British music jazz scene here, the left field jazz scene. It's kind of artists who are inspired by Coltrane, Miles Davis, Alice Coltrane. There's an incredible amount of young, mainly black kids who've picked up on jazz and created all these amazing bands that are playing in sweaty little clubs in London, right? Which I'm going tonight. You know, I'll be in a little sweaty club in front of 150 people. Well, I won't be in 150 people. I'll be at the back of the room doing it, not because I think this is a commercial thing, but because I love the music. And it's kind of very kind of interesting underground. And it reminds me of my days of roadieing in punk clubs when I used to go and roadie for bands like Generation X or whatever. It's kids jumping around. And this is sweaty music. This is not like polite Kenny G jazz. This is like, you know, roll your sleeves up and dive in and dance like crazy, left field, noisy, where jazz meets electronica with loud saxophones in your ear, you know, doing all kinds of crazy shit. That is very exciting to me. So, but you know, I manage a bunch of songwriters who are producing current hit, you know, tunes with pop artists. That is something that I can, you know, relate to, not necessarily enjoy. Like, am I going to go home and put that on my stereo? Probably not, but kids are, you know.
Yeah.
So, and for me, the essence of enjoyment of this, and it always has been, is like, how can I be associated, contribute to, be around, be with music that's at the cutting edge, that's kind of pushing things forward a bit, you know. And I've been lucky enough to juggle enough plates that have allowed me to keep one or two of those things going at any one time.
Yeah. It's a remarkable time in music in many ways, because like you mentioned Adele, and is you know, she's one of the biggest acts in the world, and we have sort of moved over to, in terms of like the biggest acts, performer focused as opposed to band focused. She did that wonderful concert at the Griffith Observatory in L.A., you know, during the pandemic and everything, and it's only so many people can pull that off in a way that will draw enough people. But below that, at the other tiers, like for here in the States, you know, like the state fair and the county fair circuit, where you can go out as a I hate to say heritage act, but a gigging band with a name that everybody would recognize. You can do that really indefinitely. Like a band like Gang of Four still exists, and that's incredible considering, like, if you were to pick a band to be around 40 years later, I don't know if you'd pick Gang of Four. You know,
Yeah.
like that, it doesn't make a lot of commercial sense, but there they are. Or a band like Pennywise here from where I'm from in Southern California. You know, they're one of the seminal active gigging punk bands. These guys were supposed to have retired and gotten married and done other things a long time ago. It turns out they did those things, but they just kept playing punk rock.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, look, you know, if you've created enough of a niche support out there, and you did something really good, you know, but you've got something that you can continue to exercise that craft,
Right.
it may well be that the fans are really coming to hear those half a dozen key songs that you wrote 40 years ago.
Right. Maybe.
Right?
Maybe. Yeah.
For sure, and there's nothing wrong with that, but a lot of those artists, especially the kind of ones which had a touch of art-based stuff in the center of it, or political messaging in the center of it, they want to continue with new music. They want to continue delivering. Now, it may be that it's harder for the fans to relate to that or pick up on that, but they're still producing new records. They're producing stuff that is harder to get to a wider audience for a whole variety of reasons, but nevertheless might be really, really good music. Like the kind of music that Neil Young was producing in the later period of his career.
Okay. Yeah.
Sensational. He was producing records and continues to produce records into his 60s and now in his 70s, where he's making amazing music, as was Leonard Cohen. Now, whether it connected on as wider basis as his earlier work, no, right? But listen, the new Crazy Horse album with Neil Young, I go and listen to it.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, when we look at the music industry, it's easy to have hip hop or trap or something drown everything out. But there is a lot going on. You're talking about Neil Young, a man in his 70s. One of the biggest gigging, stadium filling performers is still Bruce Springsteen.
Absolutely.
Sammy Hagar in his mid 70s is going to throw or I think he's going to throw a huge birthday party. I believe it. It's hard for you even to say it. I believe it's his 75th birthday party. Maybe it's his 70th. Either way, this is a madman who runs around on stage and still, takes care of his audience, puts great music out. AC/DC is touring, even though band members are dying or running out of the ability to do it. They're still out there filling stadiums, right?
I think the next generation, do I think Coldplay are still going to be gigging in 20 years' time? Absolutely. Do I think Blur are going to, and Gorillaz will be gigging in 20 years' time? Yeah, I do. I think they will. And do I think Kendrick Lamar is going to be around in 30 years' time? Yeah, I do. Some of the others, perhaps not. Some of his contemporaries, I'm afraid to say it, but a lot of the guys with the tattoos on their faces, I don't think they're going to be around in 30 years' time. But the Kendrick Lamars of this world who are trying to push music forward, who are doing something very creative. To me, Kendrick Lamar is the sort of hip hop equivalent of Björk. Doing something really as innovative and pushing the envelope out and creating music that you kind of want to listen to again. It's not just a one-off experience. It's like, I'll listen to that album in 5 years' time. So there are those artists out there who are doing that, and those people will have careers that last 30 or 40 years. I'm convinced of that.
Sure.
The question is there are two different strands for me. There's the TikTok phenomena, which is obviously, having a healthy thing about throwing people's attention on songs that perhaps they would never have considered from 70s, 80s, 90s catalogs, that are being made aware of that. But then there's the current TikTok generation of artists who are doing soundbite music, where you've got to put everything in the chorus in the first 30 seconds, otherwise you ain't going to get anywhere, affecting the way that music is being written, right? Now how much of that stuff is going to be around in 30 years' time is a good question. Every once in a while somebody will come through, but there are artists out there. The thing, every year something fantastic comes through, and this year the thing that came through or is coming through, you may not have heard of her yet, but trust me, you're going to hear of her, is a girl called Thames, Tems, from Nigeria, who is writing songs that are on a level and performance-wise and chorus-wise and vocal-wise with artists like Rihanna, with artists like Beyonce. She's coming through. She's 24 years old. Highly recommend you go out and check her out. She is incredible. I have no commercial involvement whatsoever. I'm saying this for love, not for any commercial reason. But she, I think, will be again an artist who's going to be around in 20 years' time. So, and she's only 24, So
there's something about this. Gosh, there's so many things to talk about. But when you talk about someone like Kendrick Lamar and like, does he have legs, right? Or any of the Lils in hip hop world, Lil this, Lil that. Some of these guys are going to be around, but they're going to have to be, like look at, you know, someone like Damon Albarn or even Bjork who still works. These guys are able to adapt to a new thing. I mean, who would predict on paper if someone came and briefed you the Gorillas,
yeah,
you'd say, I don't know. I don't know if that's going to work, but he can now gig as a heritage act and write
yeah.
albums for the Gorillas, and people are just going to buy him up. So
And he's doing it right at the cutting edge, the kind of people who are appearing on Gorillaz albums,
yeah,
from Billie Eilish, through to the Staples guys, through, it's incredible. And they want to be a part of that because it's continually renewing. For me, he's the David Bowie of this particular generation. Somebody who was able to read. Madonna's another one,
Yeah.
I mean, she's run out of steam a bit, fair enough. She's 63,
yeah.
But she's somebody who was able to reinvent themselves through 6, 7, 8 different iterations,
Yeah.
and that to me is, is a lifelong career. What a fantastic thing, and who
I do want to see this about Madonna though before we go past it. The last time she was on Graham Norton's show, it was like, oh man, this hasn't landed, right? And so maybe her cultural sense this time didn't work. But if you think she's out of ideas, you're wrong, right? Because she's been doing it for 40 years.
She's had moments where she's been so culturally out there, you go like, no, this isn't working. And then next album she comes back and she comes with something that's completely bang on the money, and it connects. Now look, she's 63, I mean, yes, any young 20, like Dua Lipa is going to want to do a duet with Madonna because you're in the presence of the Queen. You'll stand there and you'll take your knighthood from her, right? But does it mean that she can be as culturally relevant as she was in 1983? Probably not, or even 1993, when Ray of Light came out, which I was lucky enough to work on that album, and wow. That and Dido paid for my kids to go to school,
Wait, that's incredible. So the Ray of Light album was so, like, it was one of those reinventions, and it was so good. That music really is timeless, even though it was very poppy. Did you guys know that? Like, did you know it was going to be this much of a stalwart of her catalog?
Of course, I didn't hear the whole album. I only heard the songs that my client was working on. And when I heard those songs, I was, to me, I heard 3 or 4 songs that didn't get on the album that could have been on another album that were equally as good. Likewise with Adele, I had, like a couple of songs on the Adele record, but there was like 12 other songs that could have made somebody an amazing album that nobody will ever get to hear, which is a bit tragic because they just exist on a hard drive, and I don't think they'll ever be dug out again. Perhaps when she, perhaps in the next century they will be. But I mean, it's those kind of things. But I mean, when I heard the songs that appeared on Ray of Light, the ones that I was involved with, they were like, wow, this is incredible, just amazing. And you did have that shiver down your spine, rather like when I heard the very first time I heard, I think there's been half a dozen moments where I've heard stuff before that's been released where I went, this is a #1 fucking record, I'm like,
yeah.
I mean, I think the best example of that was You Get What You Give by the New Radicals.
Mm-hmm.
When I heard that record, the hairs stood up on the back of my neck, and I just went, whoo. And what's amazing about that record is that was 25 years ago, was it?
Yeah.
I don't even know now, but it still feels to me, I mean, look, I'm an old git, but it still feels to me incredibly current. If you put that on now, I still get those, shivers down my spine, So
it's just so great to talk to you because I just constantly have questions I want to ask about. I want to make a couple of points though. When you talk about the African market, and we've been trying to work the African market several times. Like there's been these like world music and all these movements where it kind of comes to the fore, but there's just too much distance culturally between us and them. But I
Mm,
think that you're right, that there is something now with the ubiquitousness of music and availability and it's funny because Algiers, the capital of Algeria, is, I don't know, 1,000 miles from London,
mhm,
and,
mhm,
in terms of the states, that'd be like LA to Denver, right?
mhm,
Which is
mhm.
nothing. You could drive it, you could fly it, you could fly there and back and take a meeting. I mean, it's that close. Tripoli,
Mm.
the same thing. And these are places that are culturally vast
A
differences
world away.
away,
Mm.
but now with all the technological advances and the closing up of that part of the global world, maybe there is something, because there's some great like rap from the early 2000s from Algeria for some of these, and it's
Yeah,
political and it's talking about all of the things that we all talk about, but it's through this African lens, and it's powerful.
yeah. I totally agree with you. I mean, I was inspired. What brought me into African music was Fela Kuti, right? Who you
Okay.
can see behind me over my
Yeah.
right shoulder. There you go. And normally there's another big, huge Fela Kuti poster there from a gig from in Paris in 1980, but that's on loan. But we're putting on an exhibition in Paris next week, which will last for 6 months at the Philharmonie, which is all about Fela Kuti. So if anybody gets to Paris, you really need to go and see that. It's going to be quite an incredible exhibition. I'm an insane collector of everything he ever did, and I have a load of artwork and all the original Nigerian vinyl records and stuff like
Sure.
that. So that's all going over there. But that was the entry point for me. And the entry point was particularly because what is this incredible music, this kind of
Mm.
Afrobeat music, which is just like with these 8-piece brass sections. And he's talking about some seriously political stuff,
Yeah.
and he
Yeah.
was standing up against the Nigerian dictatorship, and he was the only one who was doing it, and writing radical songs, and they hated him, but the people loved him,
Yeah. Right.
and his story is, as one could call him the African Bob Marley, if you like.
Yeah.
But if you've never heard of him, Kendrick Lamar certainly has, and
Hmm.
Beyonce certainly has. So go and check Fela Kuti, because it's a life-changing experience. But I mean that, and now we're talking 40 years later now. He died in 97.
Yeah.
Now finally, because primarily of the internet, the the leveling of the playing field that's allowed, those Nigerian artists who have got some real talent, have learned their craft. Now
Right.
they're finally putting on shows that are comparable to the kind of artists that that have, one would have said puts on an amazing show. If you're talking about Beyonce, if you're talking about Rihanna, if you're talking about Pink, if you're talking about Drake, if you're talking about, Kanye, although I'm not a big fan of his live shows. If the shows in terms of quality are comparable, the skills, they've learnt those skills, and now the business is catching up with the, and able to support and deliver them.
Right.
The artist management side has grown to a level where, the labels have decided to go and reinvest. Universal, Sony, Warner's have all opened offices in Lagos. They've opened offices in Dakar, in Senegal. They've opened offices. They've always had offices in South Africa, but they've
Sure.
re up them a gear. So they're taking Africa very, very seriously, and they know with WizKid coming over, with Drake picking up on that kind of relationship, with Essence being such an enormous hit. By the way, Thames was on that Essence song. These kind of things are getting a lot more
Mm.
visibility, So
Yeah. It's it's remarkable. There's so many things. You're such a treasure trove of knowledge. I always love to bring up when I have folks from England on the show. I always love to bring up like how Paul Weller is so fantastically successful. I mean, this is one of the greatest musicians of the last 50 years.
I love that guy. I went on tour with the Jam in 1979.
See, this is what I'm talking about, the Jam, and he's like, "Yeah, one of the biggest bands ever. I'm leaving, and I'm gonna go do this other thing." one of the most successful bands ever. I'm leaving. I'm gonna go do this next thing. He just has the ability to create all this stuff. And now, like that show at the Barbican he did, kind of, what we over here would call pops music, right? You're taking and reimagining popular music or music from an artist with a symphony behind it.
Yeah.
And it's just wonderful, and he had Celeste come in and Boy George came in and sang. And what a fantastic way. Peter Hook has done the same thing with New Order and Joy Division stuff.
Yeah.
I just love this. Are there people like a Paul Weller who is just so great at, like Paul Weller, and I'm gonna say this because it's true, Paul McCartney, these guys can write songs.
Yeah.
There is no limitation to their ability. Are
Yeah.
there people out there right now who are able to be recognized and really do something like what Paul Weller did, where you're like, I'm just gonna chant, I'm tired of that, I'm doing this, and then we're all like, hey, whatever you do, we're just gonna love it.
Sure. Sure. I mean, look, it's very interesting to see, who's going to sort of like be able to reinvent themselves in the way that people like Weller, the people like Bowie, and even to an extent, people like McCartney were able
Yeah.
to do. I'm impressed that you know about Weller because, I mean, obviously you're a music fanatic, so that's kind of good. Obviously, Weller and the Jam weren't particularly successful in the US. They never really
Right.
broke the US, right?
Right.
So, one could say that the only, acts that came out of punk, who broke the US to a degree, or who the average person in the US would be aware of, were the Pistols and the Clash, right?
Right.
But if you're an aficionado, you would know about the Jam, you would know about the Buzzcocks, and another 20 or 30 great groups. But
Sure.
Weller grew out, and then he, as you say, he then created the Style Council in the 80s, which was like bringing in dance music and jazz,
Yeah.
and then went off and did his own solo thing, where he just became this, I would say, Neil Youngish type
Sure. Yeah.
character, but great, beautiful music. Still, appealing to a minor audience in the States, but here he's legendary status.
Yeah.
Similarly, with an artist like Robbie Williams, who I'll be going and seeing play live next week. I was involved with him early on. Take That. We did their first big hit single, Could It Be Magic, 93 or something like that. And he is an artist who reinvented himself like unbelievably, and nobody would, having seen him in the early iterations of Take That, nobody would have ever said that. Again, here played the biggest ever concert in the UK. 360,000 people turned up to see him play at Nebworth, right?
Yeah.
Which is where Zeppelin, which is where Oasis, which is where, I saw Pink Floyd there, huge audiences, but he doubled the size of that audience,
Yeah.
And like Robbie Williams, he probably could sell out, one night at the Ritz in New York, or it's like I don't even know what would be the equivalent in LA. Maybe 2,000 maybe he could play the Rainbow a couple of times.
Yeah, but he probably couldn't play the Hollywood Bowl, like 17K. He probably couldn't do that.
No, he couldn't do that. He could do like 2 nights at the Rainbow. It's
Sure.
like whatever. But that which is kind of interesting. But yeah, look, is Harry Styles going to be that guy? I mean, look, what a phenomena he's turned out to. I mean, like, I wasn't bright enough to spot it, that he would be the one who could break through and create that. Now, he seems to have the ability to be able to reinvent himself.
Right.
And, is he going to be sat on a stage, with a guitarist, and delivering songs in 20 years' time? Yeah, maybe he is. Maybe he's one of those guys, but there will be others. But music's fragmenting, in the sense that there's lots more smaller niche markets, So are there artists who are going to be able to break through and have that massive a reach? Well, we keep saying this, but yeah, look, he's just done that, right? As I said before, BTS have done that.
Yep.
Blackpink have done that. There will continue to be those people who defy the norm. Now, the norm at the moment is the fracturing marketplace, where audiences for individual artists are much smaller.
Yeah.
But they can make a career off the back of having 50,000 fans instead of 1 million or
Right,
5
right.
you know, because those 50,000 fans are prepared to pay 10, 20, $30 per year to be
Yeah.
involved with that artist, maybe more, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
That
Yep.
adds up to a sustainable career, right?
It's true.
You know, and the people who are funding themselves via Bandcamp or Patreon, the ones who've got it very clever, you know, the ones who kickstarted this with like people like Amanda Palmer and whatever, who managed to create sustainable small careers, but have built them to a solid base that they know they've got enough people there that they can put out an album every year, they can tour, and they've got enough money to have a sustainable career. They're never going to be sat there in Malibu. That's not what's going to happen to them, right?
Right.
But they're still going to be playing in 20 years' time.
There's again, there's a lot to say about all of this because I'm fascinated by the business side of it. A friend of mine is, I don't know if you know Matt Hoy, but he used to sing with UB40 with Ollie and Astro, and now he's on his own. He puts a song out. He's so damn good at writing songs and singing and just pouring his heart into it. They consistently go top 5, if not reliably to the #1 on the Heritage chart. That's a solid living right there, you know, and you build together this smaller audience. You know, I don't know if people will continue to do stadium tours here in the US and worldwide, but you know, like every time U2 goes out, it's the biggest, or U2 Rolling Stones, depends on who goes out. And the Rolling Stones are, you know, they're 80 something years old and they're still out there
And
touring and
they're putting on good shows.
yeah, good shows.
They're
Yeah,
putting
yeah.
on good shows. It's not like they're like, oh God, you know, it's like
Uh-huh.
seeing somebody being wheeled onto the stage in a wheelchair. No,
Yeah.
they're still rocking out, and I think
Yeah.
they'll do it as long as they can. And I think U2 will do it as long as they can. They love it so much, you know,
Yeah.
and the audience is willing to pay for it. But I mean,
I'm curious. This is a question I want to ask because going back to what you were saying a few minutes ago about, you know, the subscription base, right? I mean, this goes back to Mozart, who had kind of figured this out and was putting this together. I don't need a patron. I need all of you to come to my shows. Right now, we look 250 years later. We've got this different way of doing things. But so today, and as soon as we're done, and it's in the back of my mind, and I'm excited about it because I love you too. Bono's book tour is going to drop tickets, and I got advanced ticket sales because I'm in the U2 fan club. And so I'm hoping that when his LA date opens here in about an hour for me, that I get tickets to go see this very unique experience. And it's Bono, so you know it's going to be great. But this is another thing. So I'm curious, a band like U2 has such a massive worldwide impact. It must be enormously expensive to satisfy that audience, especially when they've put the bar like over the moon, you know, to what's a great U2 show. You know, sure, they can strip it down and do something, but there's just a lot of work. You have to produce a lot of products. You got to pay a lot of people, you know.
But the profit is just incredible. I mean, you know, the Rolling Stones tour, I wish I had the figures in front of me, but I mean, they made hundreds of millions of dollars profit, right? A U2 tour makes hundreds of millions of dollars profit, you know?
Yeah.
That's after the investment that they're putting in to build the craziest motherfucking stage that you could possibly imagine, you know? So, you know, they may be putting in, you know, 10, 20, 30 million in pre-tour expenses and setting it all up. But boy, oh boy, are they going to reap the benefit from the ticket sales. And you know that when they go out on tour, they can tour that for 3 years, you know?
Yeah.
So, you know, Harry Styles, you know, is now in a similar place. You know, he's making so much money off this. Ed Sheeran is touring with him and a guitar, you know? And he's got some lights, right? But I mean, the profitability of doing, you know, 6 nights at Wembley Stadium. You know, we're not talking about Wembley, the indoor arena. We're talking about at 100,000 capacity stadium, right? Where the tickets are $150 each, you know, minimum, and you've got 100,000, 90,000 people turning up, you know, and then the merch, and then the beer sale. You know, I mean, the profitability of these things is staggering. But these are unicorns, you know, these are unicorns, these people. But it's interesting. A lot of the the ones that are coming through are still British, which makes me proud. I don't have a lot to be proud of in this country right now, but the music that shines through internationally from the UK, that makes me proud.
Right. We always ask this question too when we have British folks on. Why are you guys so good at soul music? Like, why do you get it so well that we love it? I mean, Adele, just another example of just, Matt Hoy. It's just soul music. Maybe there's you before, like reggae style, but the soul thing is
Hmm.
just incredible.
Hmm.
Why?
Wow, that's a really interesting question. I think that there's English people aren't very show busy, right? So I think that what comes through before the sort of showbiz element comes through is, we were raised on the Beatles, so lyrically things are really, really important, and stuff that can connect emotionally is really, really important. And you're talking about soul. There is a connection with soul music because, if you, to me, behind my shoulder on the other side, you see an Aretha Franklin 1973 poster there
Nice.
on
Yes.
the wall, and which I managed to get in LA about 30 years ago. It was hanging behind the counter at Amoeba.
Huh.
And I said to the guy, what do you want for that? He said, it's not for sale. I said, what do you want for that? And I kept going until it was for sale. And I walked out of the shop with that 1973 Aretha Franklin poster, right? And I'm very, very glad that I did, because she is, to me, the definition of soul music, obviously. And there's something that, if you look at, there's a strand between Aretha Franklin and Adele, isn't there? There's something about that connectivity that with the voice, but also lyrically, that touches your emotion and your soul. And Adele is soul, and it's not the traditional kind of thing that you would call soul music, but yeah, it's a really interesting. I've never really pondered that before, but there is a big connection between a lot of the great British artists who can
Right.
express that soul.
Yeah. It's
Good question. How it arose. I think there's a thesis in there for somebody who wants to write it.
yeah. There's a connection there for sure. And really just the English islands, right? There's just not enough of you there to have this much success over and over and over again. Especially when you look at like how big, say, Tokyo is,
Yeah.
and their impact. But you guys have managed to create a machine that has enough talent and enough business savvy, enough people like you who understand how to put these things together, that your guys' success for sure is outsized based
Yeah.
upon how many people are there.
Well, I think London, particularly Manchester, they're amplifier towns.
Okay.
So because, okay, London's a big city, right? But
Right.
it's still, you can kind of get to know a lot of people, and certainly in the 70s, 80s, and 90s and 2000s, before the artist explosion of turning on MySpace, and suddenly the volume of artists multiplied times 50, right? Before that period, the gatekeepers, as they were, was a limited amount of people, right? So we had, back in those days, NME, New Musical Express, Melody Maker, and Sounds. We had 3 weekly newspapers, 4
Right.
actually, Record Mirror 2. We had Radio 1, BBC Radio 1, which was the one radio station you needed to get onto, right? We had a couple of commercial stations, but not many, right? We had Top of the Pops, which was the one TV show you wanted to get onto, right?
Right.
There were 30 music journalists, right, who you needed to influence. There were 30 programmers who you needed to influence, right? But there wasn't 30,000 blogs, right? There wasn't 250 radio stations and 5,000 internet radio stations.
Right.
It was a much more narrow. So because we were a small island, right, the talent, if it could get to those people, could get amplified much quicker. And because Top of the Pops was the dominant TV show going out on a Thursday night at 7 o'clock, and 13, 14 million people would see you on Top of the Pops, the next day everybody knew who you were. And because you had that amplification, suddenly the Americans, Seymour Stein would go, oh, okay, this is great, we'll put this out on Sire, right? And then suddenly you had the ability to be able to reach out to a big audience in the US, right? Off the back of that amplification that this small little scene could create, you know?
Yeah.
So that there was a sort of mechanism in that gave British music a certain sort of boost, platform dominance that we capitalized on, you know?
Yeah.
And, you know, you look at it, you know, from, you know, obviously the early Brit invasion of the 60s that was led by, you know, the Who, you know, Pink Floyd, the Stones, the Beatles, obviously, but another 30 groups, you know, ending up with, you know, Fleetwood Mac and everybody else from there on in, you know, that gave British music scene an identity and an aura of expectation that gave us a benefit that was cleverly capitalized on.
You talk about the different places that created sounds. You know, okay, if we get London, because whatever, 20 million people plus or whatever, depending on the era that you're talking about. But Manchester, that's, that's still today only about 500,000 people there. And sure, you can bring in like Salford, where New Order is from, that kind of thing. And who would ever guess that a band as big as New Order would come out of a place like Salford? But then again, who would guess that Athens, Georgia would produce the B-52s, REM, and a bunch of other acts?
Absolutely.
Yeah, so how do you explain like Manchester and their impact? And then I'm also curious, you said The Clash earlier, one of my favorite bands of all time, but I've realized as an adult, that's not a punk band. They're one of those genre defying bands where
Correct. I mean, if you listen to London Calling, if you listen to Sandinista, you know,
Yeah.
and you go back to the first album. The first album was punk,
Sure.
you know, but it was, you know, they weren't afraid of being able to play their instruments, you know. And of course, Joe Strummer, I was lucky enough to see the band that Joe Strummer was in before The Clash, which was called the 101ers, which came out of a pub rock. We had a scene called pub rock. Before punk, we had pub rock, right? And there were like 100 pubs in London, right? And pubs in Manchester and wherever. The bands would go and play, and they'd go and play 3 nights a week. They would find gigs to play, you know? And these pub rock bands were the forerunners of the punk bands, you know? And then punk came in 76, 77 and kind of blew that out of the water, you know, but it was based on pub rock, really, you know? And Stiff Records came, you know, brought elements of the pub rock bands, became the producers of the punk bands. Nick Lowe was a pub rock guy, you know, and he produced all of those early punk records, you know. And, you know, in Manchester, of course, you had Factory Records. It was centered around, you know, it was lucky enough to have a label there that could act as a focal point, and, you know, with a certain ratio, with Joy Division morphing into New Order. I was lucky enough to see Joy Division live. And, you know, the Smiths, of course, you know, coming out of Manchester, the Buzzcocks coming out of Manchester, you know, then later on, the acid house scene morphing into what was going on with Factory Records created the Hacienda nightclub, which of course then birthed the Happy Mondays and that whole scene, which, you know, really became something meaningful. That is my phone, which I need to turn off. Sorry.
That's all right. Deal with it. We'll get it figured out.
And I also need, because we want to continue this conversation a bit further, I'm guessing, do we?
If you don't mind, if you know.
Yeah, no, sure. Oh, Jesus Christ, hang on.
I'll fill some time.
I'm live Zoom at the moment, so can I give you a call back? Thank you. Bye bye. I'm just going to tell the person that I was going to have a call with next that I'm going to be.
Do what you got to do. While you type that out, I'll just talk and I'll vamp for you.
You go ahead.
this is so I mean these are the things like when you look at the people who are making the music decisions, whether it's, you know, I mean, gosh, there's so many people who are in this industry who have such a positive view of it. And it's great to hear you talking about all these different acts and these different eras. Do you by chance, do you know David King? He's sort of a British American person. He's done a ton of stuff. He was on the show the other day. He actually connected me to Bruce Dickinson, you know, and
Okay.
he works with him sometimes. Do you know David at all or no?
I know the name, but I'm not sure if I know him. Is he somebody who came to live in LA?
Yeah, he's like from Texas originally, but also is very, you know, British in his own right. You know, and he was around the Sex Pistols, you know, when they
Yeah.
were really, and I'm like, are they a boy band? And he's like, actually, in a lot of ways, they really are a boy band. They were sort of manufactured. But he talked about how he took the picture of Sid Vicious and Nancy, like kind of nodding off, and then at the end
Oh,
of
he
their
took that
interview.
picture at the Chelsea hotel in New York.
Yeah, yeah. So
That
he
was
was
that,
like,
that was the one.
yeah, he's tied to that scene in that way, and so, like, you guys for sure have been in the same room at the same time, that's why I asked the questions, but that scene, The Clash, the Sex Pistols is one album, right? But they
Yeah,
have this
really, and
indelible
everything went
mark.
downhill after that. I mean, Glenn Matlock wrote the songs,
Right.
right? The guy who wrote all the songs is the guy who got the thin end of the stick, you know,
Yeah.
because he wasn't the sexy one, right?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
but he was the guy who actually wrote all of those songs. He was, you know, him and Lydon wrote the songs. You know, Lydon wrote the lyrics, and Glenn wrote the music. But I think he had quite a lot to do with the lyrics as well. Glenn
Right.
is. I'm saying this with a little bit of bias. You know, I'll have to hold my hand up. Glenn is a good friend, and I love him. And
Mhm.
but you know, he's the guy. You know, let me tell you something. There's those Sex Pistols reunion shows that happened in
Uh-huh.
the late 90s and the 2000s. They were really good. They
Mhm.
were amazing.
Yeah.
Like, I went and saw them at Finsbury Park. Stupidly, I wore a yellow Jasper Conran suit. What was I thinking? Which came out in rags at the end of that show. And
Yeah.
then I saw them a couple of times afterwards at Crystal Palace and then again at Hammersmith Odeon. They were fucking amazingly good
Yeah.
shows. I mean, they
Yeah.
could play. You know, I mean, Steve, I mean, Jones and Cook were just incredible, you know. So similarly, I mean, like, you know, those Stooges reunion shows were
Oh,
absolutely just the best, you know, just
yeah.
like Iggy on fire, you know, with
Yeah.
Ron Ashton and all the rest of it. So grateful that I got to see those shows, you know. But you know, I mean, like the Clash were a phenomenal band. I mean, just phenomenal, and that, you
Yeah.
know, that really, so sad that that didn't continue. You know, that Joe left, and there was a kind of running out of steam towards the end. Yeah,
Sure.
you know, combat rock and stuff like that wasn't as great. Um, but you know, imagine if Joe was still alive now, and the Clash were going to come back, and you know, because Simonon, who is a super nice guy, of course, plays bass in Gorillaz. You
Right.
know, and he's great. He's just as creative as ever, and he's just a lovely guy, you know. And
Yeah.
but
You
yeah,
know, like, Joe was sitting with Johnny Cash at the end of, well, really at the end of both of their lives, and Johnny had this whole thing that he did with Rick Rubin, you know, and there's something like that because Joe has such a unique upbringing and, an important view for the world. I can't imagine, like, as a fully developed adult, the songs he might write. And I'm just gonna go back to Weller for a second. He's got that, you know, 35 or 40 years later version of "It's a Very Deep Sea." Man, you can age a song in a way that you have reflection in it, and I bet Joe would have taken that tool and just
I,
made some
well,
incredible music.
I think you're right. I mean, there were so many great songs on the, you know, on those first four albums that
Mhm.
you know could be reworked in different ways, and you could
Mm.
see. Of course, he had the
Mhm.
Mescaleros later on, you know, which was another fantastic band. He just died
Right.
way too young, you know. It's just
Yeah.
like that was like one of the great losses, you know. It's like, you know, we lost him. We lost Prince too young, you know. I
Oh
mean,
my gosh, Prince.
you
Yeah.
know,
Yeah.
just
That
like
one still hurts too, because even though Prince had done so much, you know, you're just like, he had so much more to go. And it's these simple things like, using the U2 example, that song, So Cruel, right? And it's this guy basically talking to his, former girlfriend, wife, or whatever it is, and it's about, like, "You're so cruel." But the adult version is you have this argument and then you flip it back on yourself and you say, "I was so cruel," because
Mm,
you look back with it in a different way. And all of these things were guys like Joe and Bono and who can take these lyrics and they can not just turn a phrase, but they can completely change the phrase to make it belong to anybody. Oh my God. Like I would, yeah, just not having Joe around to continue to write songs. He taught me so much. I'm 52, so I'm a little bit younger than you, but I was old enough that like that music mattered to me and was absolutely fresh and relevant. And I'm like, what are these things he's talking about? And you'd have to pull out the encyclopedia back then, but you could get educated. It's like Sting,
I,
throwing out all these references, you had to get to
I got
understand.
two connections there, which I'm going to name drop because I'm going to become really boring here. But I got to roadie with the Police
Oh, wow.
before Sumner joined, and it was a guy called Henry Padavani who was the guitarist, right?
Uh-huh.
And the Police were an out and out punk band, right?
Right.
And then that lasted for about 6 months before they got rid of Henry and Sumner joined. But I only roadied for them then, and then but the other one was U2. So there's less than half a mile from where I'm sat right now. There is there was a live music venue called the Moonlight Club, which
Mm.
was in a pub called the Railway Inn, which also in the 60s hosted a club called Kluk's Clique, where Hendrix played maybe
Mhm.
4 or 5 times, but it was like it was the psychedelic club. Then it morphed into in the 80s, in the 80s, at the end of the 70s, into in this place called the Moonlight Club.
Mhm.
And I had a band called The Sound, who I was managing and putting out on my label, who became quite an influential band, actually. Amazing band. If you love this kind of music, go and check it out.
Yeah.
And U2 were massive fans of The Sound, right?
Mm.
Now, U2 was still playing in clubs at this point, and they said, "Can The Sound come and support U2 at the Moonlight Club?" So, sure. So the Moonlight Club holds 150 people,
Yeah.
and so The Sound and U2 did a show at the Moonlight Club,
Oh,
right?
so cool.
And that was pretty special. And then we all went out to dinner afterwards, right? And Paul McGuinness took us out to dinner, and with Bono and the other guys and The Sound, right? And we had this, we had this very kind of drunken dinner that I can still remember. At least I was drunk. I don't know about don't know about you too, but it was a very enjoyable dinner that night. But yeah,
Yeah.
I just thought I'd mention that, man.
No, it's incredible to have these moments, right? And to know these folks before they had made it. And U2 was such an explosion, right? They went from those kind of clubs to trying to play stadiums and amphitheaters. It's just it's
Yeah.
a crazy story. I don't actually want to take your entire day up, even though I can't. I'm loving talking to you. Is there anything else you want to say, like in the last couple minutes here, and then we'll wrap it up, and then definitely have
Um,
you back on the show.
I mean, the music world has evolved and will continue to evolve at a pace. It's like it's very difficult to project into the future about how things are going to go, because
Right.
who would have predicted TikTok 5 years ago, right?
Yeah.
It's like, what other things are going to come out that are going to completely change the way and impact the music industry in a way that's impacted it. But the bottom line is, people love real music, people love live music. For me, live music is the root to the soul. If an artist can connect with me live, then they've got me for life.
Right.
And I will go and see that artist again and again and again. And that's the thing that keeps me going. I mean, yes, I'm involved in making records and continue to do so and love that, but there's nothing like standing in front of a band who are cooking and delivering something that's emotional, connects with you on a level that you can't otherwise connect with.
Yeah.
That will go off into the future forever. So very excited about that.
I just want to take a second more and say this too, that when these newer artists discover it's worth their time and money to bring in that horn player, and
Yeah.
just let those horns, or like if you sit in front, I love all kinds of music, so I go see classical music all the time. And when there's someone playing the pipe organ has me. I'll just go because that thing, it's like it's so powerful. It's like, oh, the symphony's an adorable little toy. I'll back down. But at some point, you're going to have to all clear out, and I'm going to make this entire room shake and force you to feel these things, like these instruments that are not just this linear speaker sound, but just feel your entire body and everybody, and resonates, and it just connects you. Live music and again, horns and pipe organ, these things are just massive, and you're forced to deal with them when they show up.
Absolutely. And you know what, the other thing is that the sort of level of instrumentation that's coming in that is unusual. So people bringing in different kind of instruments from Africa, from China, from all over the place. When those kind of things get mixed together, that's something that's really fascinating to me, and that's something that I think we're going to see more of in the future. You know, it's like bringing in different sounds. People want to hear different sounds. People want to hear that orchestra from Bombay that has a completely different way of playing stringed instruments that you're used to, but it gets weaved into the track in a way that gives you something completely different. They want to hear those weird instruments from Turkey, but put them over a hip hop beat, you know? So, you know, that's, you know, the future of music is multiculturalism. Listen, there's a big backlash against multiculturalism, but the one area where multiculturalism will continue to thrive and will continue to influence people, please God, bring us into a brighter future, is music, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a great version, and I can't remember the artist's name. He's from Africa, but he does a version of Lionel Richie's "Stuck on You," and it's beautiful, and he sings it differently. All right, let me wrap this thing up so I can turn you loose here. Stand by 1 sec. Hey, thanks for watching the show. I really appreciate it. Right here, you can subscribe. Please do that. It makes the show grow. Hit that notification bell so you know which incredible guest is coming up next. Down below is the PayPal link. You can put a small subscription in. That is an enormous help. All that money goes right back into the show. And then right up over here are the next episodes you should listen to, curated by yours truly. Thank you so much.